But in some ways, our ancestors were wizards, not like Harry Potter and shit like that. But if you really do the research and understand what this was, you and I having this conversation right now is impossible. Impossible. And so what I realized is, and I knew this even in making the show, but what I hope is in receiving the show, people will understand that this is not even an attempt. This is just us recontextualizing our ancestors because they've been textualized or contextualized. I don't know what the word is. They've been framed so poorly for us through the education system that we've been given. The same education system that was built out of the foundation of the very system that disenfranchised them in the first place.
Hey,
Hey, how you doing?
what's wrong? Why are you so low key right now?
No, no, I'm good. It's been a long week. Yeah.
So I was watching the screener and it's intense. I would love to start by it's beautiful, but it's of course it's intense. How did you come to do underground?
Yeah. When I was a kid, I was always kind of fascinated with the Underground Railroad. I mean, when I first heard the words Underground Railroad, I saw Black folks on trains underground. Like, not even imagine it. I like legitimately believed that we had built trains underground. And I didn't grow up in New York, so I'd never seen the New York subway. I'd only seen it in movies. But I really, truly believed that we had built this network of trains underground. And then you learn what the actual Underground Railroad is. But I always held on to that feeling because I must have been like maybe in like the first or second grade when I first heard the words Underground Railroad. And I was a big fan of Colson's work. And when I heard that he had written a book about this, I assumed that he was going to do something with the conceit to make the railroad real. And then I read it, which was way back even before Moonlight came out. And I just felt like, okay, cool, this is the one. Because I always knew I wanted to eventually do something that involved the story of our ancestors. I always knew I wanted to do something that revolved around or dealt with or excavated the condition of American slavery. And this felt like the perfect fit for me to do that.
So when you said as a child you always thought about the Underground Railroad as the actual railroad, I was trying to think back to when I first heard about the railroad and what I thought about it. And I actually can't remember, but I do remember a couple of years ago on Atlanta Housewives when one of the housewives thought the Underground Railroad was an actual railroad and how people laughed at that. But the fantasy of it actually being like this physical train is kind of it is kind of an amazing way to talk about this story, right?
I think it's beyond amazing. I think that for me, when I look back on my younger self, I think about how beautiful and innocent and just free a child's mind is. That I didn't even imagine it. I just knew, I saw. And as you know more than anyone, our education system is just built in such a way that we don't teach many perspectives on anything, especially in the place that I grew up going to public schools. So even when the gaps were filled in and what the Underground Railroad actually was, I thought, oh, so it was white people leaving biscuits and quilts out in their yards. That was what I went from this huge big thing,
Mm.
almost like a Marvel cinematic universe, to people leaving bread and milk on their back porch, and hiding messages and quilts, which is still amazing because having done this research, everything was basically impossible or implausible. But I think when I've heard that story about Booming on the Real Housewives, and I don't feel any kind of way about it. I think it's incumbent upon us, and I think it's why I was so glad to sit and talk to you about this. I mean, shit, I don't know how I'm going to hang in this conversation, but I think the work that you've been doing is filling in some of these cavities, some of these gaps, in our public consciousness and our historical record. And so when things like that happen, it's like, of course they do, because we don't do the work to fill those spaces in. Now, I will say I'm making a show where the Underground Railroad is a real thing. So I might confuse some people, but hopefully it'll just drive them back to the actual history.
We are taught this history so poorly.
Mhm.
Like, I was doing some research the other day, and most American kids don't even know that Frederick Douglass used to be enslaved.
Mhm.
But the only reason we learn about Frederick Douglass is because he ran away from slavery and became an abolitionist. So you realize that the way that we've dealt with this history is not to completely erase it, but to totally disconnect it from the brutal system that it was trying to undermine, right?
But I think that disconnection is a form of erasure.
Yeah.
I really do. What I knew of Frederick Douglass growing up, and again, I grew up in a, I mean, they tried, but it just wasn't the best public school system. Oh, Frederick Douglass is the black abolitionist who shook Abraham Lincoln's hand. That was what it was to me. And so I do think in this disconnection, it is amounting to erasure. And I also think too, well, that's for later in the conversation. I think erasure is the thing that we're facing the most, or I think it's the scariest prospect for me, and it's why even though some of these images are quite difficult to witness to, I think the opposite or the converse, the only other option is erasure, and I think we just can't have that.
Yeah, I agree. I was thinking about the last time we saw each other in person was in Atlanta, and you were filming.
Mhm.
Um, and so to watch Underground and see how you could recreate that sense of place and time, is just, I mean, you're an artist, so it's not surprising. But then also thinking about Moonlight and how different just the look and the feel of these two films are. What was like I want to get back on some of the history stuff in a second, but what were your fears, when you decided to take this on, and how do you not, I know as a writer, you learn how to do, I learned how to write. I know how to write. And so you kind of fall back in the way that you know how to do, even though the subject matter may change. Let's talk about what were your fears. And then I would love if you could talk about how you ensured that it would also feel very different from what you've done in the past.
Yeah, I'll answer the second part first. To feel very different, that was kind of easy. I mean, this is just such a whole different world than anything I've worked on, and even the way of working is so different than anything I've worked on. I mean, this was a long, long shoot. You ask how I was able to create these worlds and whatnot. It was by on the weekend going out and get a whiskey with a good friend, you know, to make sure I could bring myself back to myself. Um, but um, but yeah, it was one of those things where, as we were there working on the show, like you said, I'm a writer, I know how to write. I'm a filmmaker, I know how to film scenes. Once we got into it, and especially because we filmed the entire show in the state of Georgia, we were walking these spaces that my ancestors walked, and there were all these really wonderful people. I was talking about this yesterday. There were all these Civil War actors, all these white gentlemen with all these old guns, and they get in these battlefields and they pretend that they're having these battles. I think there are also Black folks in the South who are doing the work to preserve these traditions of our ancestors. And we had so many of them who came down to basically make sure that we were being accurate in these portrayals, especially with our background actors. And so working with those folks and also working, just using my instincts and all the crew that I've always worked with, we found a way to get into the rhythm where it wasn't that we were building the world, we were just building the moment in front of us.
Mm.
Now, fear, the fear, film is a very seductive, powerful medium. And these images that we are dealing with here are very powerful as well. They're very triggering and they're very incendiary. And I always had to be aware, I was always fearful that I was going to lose my focus on where the moral and ethical line was and being forthright about these depictions, but also not allowing the depictions of these things to devour myself or the audience, or especially the actors who were creating them. So I almost had to have two minds. The one mind of the artist, I'm just here to make a work of art. But then the other mind is almost like an ethicist, where I have to really make sure that I'm doing this for the right reason in the right way. And I'm only taking it as far as necessary. And I think it created this scenario where it felt like I was making two films at once. And kind of in a certain way, I think I did make two films or two shows at once. At least in my head, I did.
So explain.
I mean, the one movie is the story of Cora Randall. She's on this journey. It's this big adventure almost, but it's rooted in the condition of American slavery. That was the one movie. And then this other movie was, I'm also aware of the power of the possibility of doing harm with these images. And so that also, I'm making that in my head so I know to not make that.
Mm-hmm.
This version that goes too far. And so I always had to be aware of, okay, this is what we're actually doing. This is what we cannot do. And I had to see it in order to not do it, because these things are very seductive. And then there was this third thing that happened, which was, I think we're talking about disconnection and erasure. I feel like we haven't been allowed to really see our ancestors, like to really see them. One, the historical record has systematically erased them, but even imagistically, there are very few portraits, there are very few photos of our ancestors. And here I am with all these tools, all this equipment, all these people. And then there were all these wonderful actors, and especially the background actors, our advisors, who were literally giving my ancestors body and voice. And so in addition to making the show that was in front of me, I would sometimes just stop filming the scenes and we would just turn the camera on our actors, because there was something that had happened. Because again, we're all in Georgia, we're on Georgia soil, we're walking in the spaces where our ancestors walked, we're doing the rituals our ancestors did, we're recreating them. And I thought, oh, I just want to see you. And so we would stop filming the show and we would just film these folks. And a few of those images have made it into the show, but we have like hours of them, because whenever the spirit arose, we would just do it. And so I created this thing called the gaze, because every time I have a conversation like this, certainly not with you, but I end up talking about the white gaze, the white gaze, the white gaze. And I'm like, well, shit, why has no one ever asked me about the black gaze or just the gaze implicit? And it's because we're so obsessed, again, making two films. I got to make sure I'm not making this from the white gaze, blah, 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 blah. But then there was this thing that we kept doing just by instinct. And like I said, some of it made it into the show. It was like, oh, this is the gaze that we don't talk about and we don't see. And this is a rare opportunity to capture it. And so that was the other film that I made as well.
I felt like so many connections to my feelings and my fears in creating the 1619 project. You have both the weight of the subject matter, but then you also have the weight of the obligation of doing right by the people, our ancestors, which I thought about, all the time on this project. And there's this question of, I love that you talked about the Black gaze, because one of the things that I was determined to do from the beginning was we were going to be completely unconcerned with how white people would feel or think about what we were doing. We were going to do the project that we needed to do. And if white people loved it and Black people hated it, we would have failed, period. Hopefully, a bunch of white folks would like it too, but that wasn't what I was thinking about at all. So because of that, there was this constant, we know the entire system of slavery only exists because of atrocious violence. Violence undergirds the entire system, and the erasure of that brutality is part of how we as Americans deal with what we have done, right? As a country, we have to pretend somehow it wasn't so bad. Folks had to work for free, but we have to really downplay the extent of the violence. The fact that people don't let you sell their children away, right? They don't let you violate them voluntarily. It's the violence. But then there's that other side of it where it's all violence. And then it becomes to feel gratuitous. I remember we printed out all the images for the project, and I was determined, like, there has to be a lynching photo in the project. Like, we can't turn away from the violence. But then once we printed it out, I saw, the photo we chose, you could see all of the man's features, right? It was so intimate that I was like, this is actually dehumanizing. Like, we are further dehumanizing in showing this image. So we picked another one, right? So we picked a different lynching image where you can still see that a Black man has been lynched, but the focus is really on the inhumanity of the crowd. So you can't see his face. You can see that it's a human being who's been lynched, but what you can see are all the faces of the white people in front, the bystanders. But it was like 1,000 of those little decisions. Like, we can't turn away from what happened, but you don't want to create something that further dehumanizes people who are dehumanized. So tell me about, I know you had a million of those moments.
Because you've seen the first episode and you know we have one of those moments.
Yes.
It was in the book, and I guess it could have been my prerogative to say, this is in the book, but it's not going to be in the show. And yet I was thinking, again, I got 3 different minds going on the show. You know, our main character is bitter and angry, and she's giving up hope. It takes an extreme act
to
get her to get past that. And this was an extreme act. I was thinking of images, just like the one you're talking about. I've seen these images, and we've seen some of these images occasionally of, unfortunately, also our ancestors lynched during Jim Crow. And it's always the aftermath, and it's always someone suspended above a crowd. And I agree, there is power. And oftentimes these people are looking, again, the white gaze, looking directly at us, proud of what they've done. And I always feel like there's something, again, disconnecting and a bit erasing about not showing the act itself. Now, there's a certain brutality and horror in the fact that these people are so proud of what they've done. I get that, but I feel like whenever we get these images, this is what we get. We don't get the other side of it. And so I thought, no one knows what it's like or we haven't seen what it's like to suspend a man by his wrist and separate his flesh with the whip. It's not just that the whip is hurting that man, it is doing things to his flesh.
Yes.
And I thought, it was tough, man. And I will say, it's visual effects. So when we filmed it, there's no blood, there's no fire, and the guy is on a harness, a wonderful actor. And so it was upon me to say how far we're going to take this. Visual effects wise, we could have taken it much farther. We actually dialed it back, and it's on screen for the briefest of moments, I believe. But I did feel like, you know what, and I have to be funny with this we, because there's so many different we's.
Exactly.
I'm not talking about you and I.
Yes.
I don't think the show was made for them either. But I did feel like it was important. When are we going to acknowledge that things happen? These things happen. When are we going to acknowledge them in their fullness? And I thought, this is the moment when I have to do this. Now, here's the thing. I wanted to give this man agency, because typically in these films, when these things happen, people are responding to acute trauma. They're screaming in pain, or they're begging for their lives. In this case, I'm trying to remember the lines. I think Big Anthony speaks to his fellow man and woman who are forced to witness. He says, no more masters, no more slaves. And then to the brutalizer, he says, God damn you, God.
Damn you, yep.
And I thought, if I can just give this man some agency, maybe I can unearth something else in this moment that we aren't often privy to, but I have to do it. And it was tough, man. And I do feel like when the show comes out, because I do think people are just and feeling like, because I can't tell anyone what the line is for them, where they've been forced to witness too much trauma, where they've been forced to witness too many atrocities visited upon Black bodies. They have to draw that line for themselves. And yet I did feel like I had to tell the truth. One, for the character, but also two, because we can't separate these acts from our ancestors. What we can do is acknowledge these acts, but then also build so many things beyond and past them. And I think that's what the show does as it goes on, or at least I hope it does. But yo, you can see how much I'm talking. That shit was hard, man.
Yeah.
I mean, it's in everything I've done creatively. There's this and the ending of Moonlight are the two most difficult choices I've ever had to make in anything I've created.
I want to go back to agency.
Mm-hmm.
I also, as a journalist, when I write about art history, I make very intentional decisions. I've written entire paragraphs that are just a litany of the violence. And I put these in almost every one of these types of stories, right? You know, they cut off people's tongues and their toes and displayed them in a storefront window. They threw body parts on the lawns of Black people. Like, I feel like again, that violence, that not talking about that violence is part of how we deny, right? That is part of the denial of what we've done. Go ahead, you were about to say something?
Well, I was going to say, in the North Carolina episode, we originally thought we would reflect that it was a town, and in the book, this is what they do. You know, after these lynchings, they then collect souvenirs and put them on
Yeah.
display as a fear tactic and as a hate tactic. And I thought, you know what? That's too far. That's too far. We're not going to do it. And that choice, and I'm glad I did. You just reminded me. I haven't thought about it in a while.
Yeah, but how many choices, right? And that's the thing. It's all this balancing, this incredibly painful and difficult balancing of how much we show, how much we say. I do think it's different to read it in a paragraph versus see it in a photograph versus see it on film. But it's still, it's like it is. We're bearing witness, and we can't. We have to look away at some points, but others we don't. But I don't know if you saw that TikTok video that went viral a couple weeks ago of this young man who said, no more slavery movies. I don't want to ever see another slavery movie again. I want to see Black Wizards. I want to see this sort of thing. And when I first saw it, I won't say I got angry, but I just was like, how, disrespectful of our stories not to want to see that, or to say you've seen enough, especially when I know how poorly we're taught about this. But then when I thought more about it, what I really think this young man was saying was he's tired of seeing movies where we have no agency, right? Mm-hmm. So whenever we see movies about slavery, it's always, and historical movies about Black people in general, it's always about what white people have done to us, mm-hmm. and us absorbing what white people are doing to us and us having no control. And it's seldom that we see, whatever. Even in Harriet, right? She's mystical. So even when we're like fighting back in the movie, it's because she's having spells. It's not her own agency and wit and intellect that's liberating her and other people. Only seeing the first episode of Underground, it seems like you are very intentionally trying to show that agency. So I wonder what you think about that when people say they're done. Well, one, I'm sure you clearly don't agree that we've had enough slavery movies, and I'm like, we'll never have enough movies on slavery because we'll never know enough. But where do you think that is coming from?
I think it is coming from the very constrained version or depictions of these images that we've received. I think maybe some of that has to do with just, again, I wanted to make this a television show because the hard images, the brutality is so loud. It's so loud no matter what you do. If you house that in a 2-hour film, those things are going to outweigh and overwhelm the viewer. With this thing with 10 hours or 10 episodes, you have the ability to compound those hard images with soft images to give another perspective and to build agency into these moments. It's interesting. I didn't see that TikTok video, but when our trailer released, oh my God, Twitter gathered me the hell up. Why is Barry Jenkins profiting off our pain? Why is Barry Jenkins trying to get the bag by doing something slaves? Why Barry Jenkins trying to steal his next Oscar? There's no Oscars. This is a television show. The one that got my attention was someone said along the lines of my man's TikTok, which I didn't see, but on Twitter, someone said, "Oh, I don't want to see any more shows about slaves. I want positive imagery." And you want to work in words. I think if you unpack that sentence, it's saying that anything that involves my ancestors is inherently negative. And that's where I draw the line. That's where I think this idea of erasure comes into play. And I just felt like, no. I mean, one, I wanted to understand the comment, but I also wanted to go, no. And it made me want to not double down because the show is done. I can't change it.
Right.
I also realized people were making these comments without having seen the show. But then I thought, just word wizards, not like Harry Potter and shit like that. But if you really do the research and understand what this was, you and I having this conversation right now is impossible. Impossible. And so what I realized is, and I knew this even in making the show, but what I hope is in receiving the show, people will understand that this is not even an attempt. This is just us recontextualizing our ancestors because they've been textualized or contextualized. I don't know what the word is. They've been framed so poorly for us through the education system that we've been given. The same education system that was built out of the foundation of the very system that disenfranchised them in the first place. And so I think it's just this big vat of work that we've all got to do. You kickstarted the hell out of it. With 1619. But yeah, I think the fatigue is real. And I think I understand where these young folks are coming from, but we've got to find a way to see ourselves and understand that, one, we're using the term enslaved now, which is great. It's very worthy, but that's about what was done to our ancestors, not about what they did. It even takes the onus off of us really seeing who they were. And
Yeah.
so this is just one part of this thing, but we got to keep going. We got to keep building.
Yeah. I mean, I clearly agree. And I also just think that, again, we have not long been in control of the narrative around slavery and telling the stories. I mean, there's a reason there's hardly any films about slave rebellions, right? There's a reason we get taught about the French Revolution and not the Haitian Revolution. There's reasons for all of these things. And so it is so many, I think, Black people feel demeaned and degraded by the history of slavery, the history of Jim Crow. But I think they feel that way because they're taught that we just took it, right? And that we didn't exercise agency in ways big and small. And also, there's so little of we had joy, right? We had love. Despite everything that was being done to us, we were fully human, but you rarely see that rendered on screen. But I think that's different than, I can't see how a filmmaker, a writer can divorce this history from our stories. Like, how do you do a story about Black folks and not acknowledge race, right? And the racial history. Juneteenth, which I loved that movie. But what I loved about it was it was interior to Black life, but we also know they're celebrating the end of slavery, right? So it seems like you can, let me ask you, is that possible? Can you tell Black stories and somehow pretend that race and racism and in America didn't exist? Can you tell a story that doesn't acknowledge that in some way?
I think you can. The story's got to be inside. I think film, that's what I love about making movies. Anything's possible. I was talking to this dude from CBS the other day, and I was like, these images are building on each other, from Roots to Mr. Parks's adaptation of Solomon Northup's memoir to Steve's adaptation as 12 Years to this. These things are building on each other. And as they build on each other, there will be more and more space for people to find their own niche. There is a story, set on the same locations that we filmed episode 1 of the show, where you see absolutely no brutality. The entire thing takes place inside the house. And there was a woman who's there, and she is the cook for the house. And over the course of 12, 15 years, she is systematically poisoning the master. And that's the whole film. There's no whips, nobody's hung. And it's like this chamber horror sort of like drama. You can totally make that. It's not upon me to make that right now, because I think these images have been built on each other to the point that you can get that niche with this. But as you said, we haven't been in control of telling these stories about our ancestors. And now that we are, we're building and we're building and we're building. So I want people to have the patience to be like, I don't want to see any images about these folks. It's like, no. These images are stacking and stacking and stacking. And trust me, they are coming. The images where you can see your ancestors in a context. But as you said, it's not just about being demeaned, because that was certainly not the totality of their experience. So yeah. Man, this is very different than the normal interviews I do about the show.
So even that example that you gave, it's still a story about race, right? I mean,
it is. So back to the bigger question. No, you can't. But I think we have to acknowledge that this is in the foundation of the American DNA. I mean, there's so many aspects of the Black experience in America that we do a real damn good job of not acknowledging. I have all these. This is a tangent. There's this really fringe, the ADOS sort of.
Oh yeah, of course.
And they coming after me. Why is a South African playing our ancestors? And sometimes they go Native African American. Sometimes they go Native Black American. I'm like, your ancestors were not American. in order to have citizenship, you have to have certain rights and certain freedoms. These people were Africans in America. And if you frame them in that way and you see the way they fought and earned every right that you and I have the privilege of, then you also get to see, oh, folks, you guys immigrated and you earned, you guys were given everything. Y'all didn't give us shit. Didn't give us shit. Also, too, you know, these folks like, oh, the South Africa can't play us. It's like, you do realize the people in the show continent of Africa than they are from someone born in Detroit in 1985. Now, if you view it that way, and we're all connected, let's stop putting up these barriers that all these other folks are hoping we will continue to put up. You know, so much about this condition, people go, oh, how could there be black bosses? Of course there were black bosses. You know, you think militaristically, of course there were black bosses. This makes perfect sense.
Yes.
Perfect sense. And this show, only 1.5 of these episodes take place in the plantation. So I'm not out to lay out all these systems. I think people like you do a much better job of that, but I'm gonna chip away at it.
Yeah.
I think people don't understand how militaristic this system was.
Yes,
I don't think
absolutely.
how government sponsored this system was. I think even the English that we were taught, it wasn't English designed for communication, it was designed for instruction, mostly to receive instructions. So much of this, anyway, that's a total tangent because the show is not about just that. The show is not about just that.
Yeah, well, I love tangents. And I also think what shows like this do is they just hint at things that you hope will then make people more curious to learn more, right? You can't do everything, but you can hint at, you know, one, the whole system doesn't work unless there's Black collaborators, because on, you know, most plantations in the Deep South, Black people are outnumbering white people, right? So you hinted at things. I mean, this is what I thought Watchmen did so brilliantly was, for one, you know, it completely had you thinking you were going to watch one show, and then it ended up being about this other thing, which is subversive. It's the way that we can force people to kind of learn this history. And all these folks thought they were making up Tulsa and then learned that this was, no, we actually do this shit in real life. I wonder if you could talk a bit about this idea of the artist and the Black artist. I've gotten this question a lot of times in my career, and I've certainly seen Black journalists who say they just want to be a journalist. I've never been like that, though. Like, to me, I exist to write about Black people, right? I am a Black journalist. Black is my primary identity. Journalism is my profession. So what do you think about that? If you produce a film that doesn't deal with race or in any way, is that like a Black story or just a story that has Black people in it? Like that to me is actually the fantasy. Instead of Wizards, like doing a Black story in America that doesn't deal with race seems like the fantasy.
I don't know that it's a fantasy. I like to think that everything is possible. But I also think that everything should be interrogated, and everything should be open to interrogation, including me, and the work that I do. So I think you'd have to pretzel the hell out of yourself to get to a point where you could make something in such a vacuum that the idea of race or Blackness were separated, you know, from the Black thing at the core of the piece. And is it worth doing all that work? You know, I don't know. Even in doing all that work, you're sort of politicizing the act itself. So I guess in that way, I don't think it's possible. You know, I don't bemoan anybody who wants to attempt that. You know, but for me, it just doesn't seem necessary. You know, there's one thing I've written that didn't directly involve Blackness, that where all the main characters were white. And even then, of course, there's still Black people in the piece because Black people are integral to the fabric of this nation, no matter how much we try to push them. Not we, it's two different
right.
we. No matter how much we try to push them to the margins. But you know, it's funny, I can't really answer that question because I don't even spend time thinking about it. You know, I think it's just implicit in what I do at this point.
Yeah. So going back to this Adolph's question. I want to trouble.
Help me with this because I don't.
Yes.
It's new to me. It kind of just like popped up, and I was like, "Wait, what? What's going on? Native African American? Like what? What does that even mean? Like what does that even mean? Like, what does that even mean?"
It means your mentions when this comes out are about to be crazy. I'm going to tell you. I have.
Look,
I think initially,
I'm down to understand. So please help me.
Initially, I think I felt very similar to you. So I definitely believe in Pan-Africanism. I believe in the diaspora, but I also do think it's okay to say that Black Americans are their own unique ethnic group with our own particular and specific history to being in a white, right, a majority white, enslaved in a majority white country founded on these ideas of liberty. And so, you know, at its heart, the movement is attempting to say, stop lumping us all in. We do have a particular story. It's very similar to how no one would ever, like me going to Jamaica as a Black American doesn't make me Jamaican, right? Like we understand that Jamaicans have an ethnicity, that Haitians have an ethnicity, but Black people have somehow been deprived of the right to have an ethnicity. So I do understand the desire to claim a particular lineage in this country. I think their approach has been god awful in terms of bringing other people into their cause. But I get it, and I'm not going to lie. As we've been moving the 1619 project into TV and film, I do think a lot about who am I providing opportunities for, and am I actually providing opportunities just for Black people as a race, or am I specifically providing opportunities to the descendants of slavery to work on a project about the descendants of slavery? Because if you disaggregate the data, Black Americans, Native Black Americans, descendants of American slavery, however you want to describe them, within the hierarchy of Black people are still on the bottom. And there's a reason for that. I'm curious about, I don't know.
But Nicole,
I think their tactics have been terrible. I think it is okay for Black people to claim a lineage and an ethnicity, Black Americans.
Well, I'm not saying that, but I have 3 women in this cast who were born on the continent of Africa, playing characters who were either born on the continent of Africa or whose mothers were born on the continent of Africa. I don't get the disconnect there. Like that's where are we trying to sever ourselves completely? Talk about disconnect and erasure. Are we trying to sever ourselves completely from our ancestors?
Well, no, and you're asking me to defend what they said in your Twitters, which I didn't say in your Twitter. But what I am saying is, I do think it's a worthy. I don't think it's a conversation that should just be dismissed out of hand. I do think that there is something to be said about not dismissing Black people in this country who descended from United States slavery, wanting to have an ethnicity, wanting to be recognized as a people instead of this catch-all umbrella group. Again, because when a South African moves to the United States, they're South African, right? Mm-hmm. A Ghanaian moves to the United States, they're Black and Ghanaian. And they're able to claim that ethnicity, but Black people don't have one. And I think everyone wants to have that sort of identity. And all the other places, you know, a lot of people say, well, the slave ship, you know, we all came on the same slave ship. True. But all those other countries, they can claim a lineage, they can claim a country, they can claim a name, and somehow we're treated as if we can't. So that I think we should not dismiss. I do get that.
We're treated as if we can't. You got to unpack that last part for me.
So, for instance, because I was having this conversation with Ghanaian American last year, and I was saying, you know, maybe we do need a particular category for Black Americans who descend from American slavery. Maybe because Black is treated as both a racial group, right? Anybody who comes from the continent of Africa, descends from the continent of Africa is Black. But here it's also treated as like our ethnic group, right? our culture, our community. And one of the things that she said was, oh, so I'm not Black, I mean, I face discrimination. That's not the definitive, right? That's not how we define Black culture. Black culture is language. Black American culture is cuisine. Black American culture is music. It is dress, the same as Jamaican culture is language, music, dress, right? Religion. But for us, we just get flattened. Like they're defining us by descending from Africa and facing racism. That is not Black culture, right? That is what white people have done, but that's not Black American culture. And there is a Black American culture.
Right, and I'm not talking about Black American culture. I think that's
but you have to be Black American, right? Like that.
Well, I will say you said Black American exclusively in this conversation, as we've been talking about ADOS. And every now and then, mostly they say Native Black American. Occasionally I'll hear Native African American. This Native part is the part that sort of bumps me. That's the part that bumps me, because that is almost participating in a certain kind of erasure of a very particular history. And that's where I get bumped. And I think there has to be, again, nuance and interrogation. There has got to be a way to figure out this middle stretch of the argument that's being made. It's getting shrunk and squished, and it's not doing anybody any services. It's just not. And part of it is because it's so difficult to figure out, okay, Africa is a big ass place. Okay, cool. If we're gonna go there, from where? You know what I mean? It can't just be Africa. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
South Africa, Uganda, people go, oh, but those ain't the Africans that we descended from. It's like, oh, okay, cool. And so we got to keep unpacking. But I think the vitriol, just the loud vitriol, that ain't it, bro. That ain't the way to get to it.
You don't have to tell me. Trust.
I know these people.
Back in my old Twitter days when I used to be battling people, which I don't do anymore.
But it did remind me of the line in Colson's book. I think I said it earlier, where John, the character says, for we are Africans in America. Something about that really clicked with me, because I do believe you can't be a citizen of a country for which you have no rights. But again, I'm always trying to open things up and excavate. It's like, okay, all those rights were earned, as you said, through living, we found a way to better democracy. Absolutely. And then I think about 65, and I think about immigration and the idea of Black folks in this country as immigrants with the hardest of roads and all the privileges that we unlocked for all the immigrants of this country. And yet the very fractured divide amongst, as you were even saying, we were talking about ADOS, amongst Black Americans or Native Black Americans. See, ADOS now, I'm using the term amongst Native Black Americans and African immigrants and all the immigrants in this country. And it's like, we got to do a better way of framing this history, because it's so damn clear that Black folks in this country walked so everybody else could run or swim or fly or whatever the hell folks are doing. Not that we need credit for those things, but I do think if we did recognize them and acknowledge them, there might be a way that we could all, I know you're gonna hate this, that we could all find a way, to make a fucking fist, man. I didn't say we trying to fight nobody, but
no. No, but that's true. I do think it is about an acknowledgement. It's not about, a big part of my essay in the 1619 Project was trying to force not just our country, but people who have immigrated because of been able to immigrate because of the Black resistance struggle, to just acknowledge what we built and what our fighting and dying and, centuries of resistance have allowed. And then not denying us, if we cannot claim a lineage here, then we're basically saying that we continue to be a people without a country. Yeah. Right. We can claim a continent that we've never been to, or we have no country at all. And no people wants to be a people without a country. Certainly not. And we were, until the 14th Amendment granted us citizenship in the country we built. We were a people without a country. Granted a citizenship in the country we built. Yes. So I do think a big part of that is we deserve to have a country. And particularly, we deserve to have a country who wouldn't have a democracy without us, who wouldn't have its economic wealth without us, wouldn't have a lot of its infrastructure without us. And I think that's really what that is about.
And to bring it full circle, I think that's where this art serves a function, because when
Yes.
you live in a country that is so either ashamed or so willfully malevolent that it wants to erase and not acknowledge the role that we've played in building this country and the role that it's played in subjugating us in the building of that country,
Yes.
rather than allowing us, rather than granting us, rather than, oh my God, rather than giving us what we are due, that we have earned, the country that we have built, and making us integral to the fabric of that country, they would rather just erase. Because it's embarrassing, it's shameful, and it's
It's
sinful.
shameful.
It's shameful and it's sinful. You know, you said something, you mentioned resistance struggle. I'm coming back to this thing. Because when you said it, there's a map of the continent over here on the wall because of this Lion King movie I'm doing. And I always think of it's a world map from like the 70s. And I always think of, we talk about migration patterns in the US, especially after the Civil War, the Great Migration, all these things, and at the turn of the century. I think of all these migration patterns from the continent out to the rest of the world. And there is something very universal about those patterns, because this resistance struggle happened everywhere Black folks went. I think that's a unifier.
Yes.
I'm not saying all, again, Pan-Africanism, I'm not saying all Black folks all over the world have the same unique experience, but I do think there's a commonality there. And it's why I think when we talk about ADOS, we have to break it out into different buckets, because you have warned me now on this. When you said, you know, every being needs a country, you know, and we have undoubtedly built this country, you know, without pay, without rights, without access to so many things. So I get that. And yet I do believe that we are united in this way, the Black, all the colored folks of the world, as my man says later in the episode.
You know, we're in this moment where Americans seem more primed and interested in excavating the period of slavery than I've ever seen in my lifetime, for sure. I can't say how often I hear that, you know, 400 years evoked, how often I hear people talking about slavery. And at the same time, we're in a moment where there's also a huge effort to try to suppress that learning, right? There's bills being introduced in states all across the country to prohibit the teaching of not just the 1619 Project, but critical race theory, which the people who write the bills don't, I think, even know what it is, to teach anti-racism, to teach history that's divisive. So can you talk about what it's like to release a series like this in a period where there's both this great interest, but also this intensive backlash about talking about slavery and the American story?
It's been unexpected. You know, these projects take so long to come to fruition, and I was thinking about it. You know, because we made the show over the last 4 years, where "Make America Great Again" was the dominating statement in the public culture. And yet it must have been seeded during the previous 8 years when a Black man was in the White House. And so many of these projects, whether it's Watchmen, you know, Lovecraft Country, Misha Green's Underground, and then here we are. And maybe seeing that symbol in the White House made us all feel like, okay, this is the time. Now this country, the world is ready to acknowledge the full facet of this history and of our role in building this history for both good and bad. So maybe that was where that was seated. And yet, at the same time, so much is happening in the world right now. I think there's been this pushback, you know, because of, you know, things open and then they contract. And I think we're in this great contraction right now. Again, clearly by the words "Make America Great Again." You know, let's reduce the amount of this country's history that we're going to acknowledge. You know, let's lean into the idea of American exceptionalism, except there's all this other shit that we have to deal with. It's a very strange time to have a show like this. And what it does do is it makes me more compassionate to people who feel like maybe they aren't ready or they don't want to see things like this. but it also buffers me, or it strengthens me in knowing that no, I think because there's so much pushback, we have to push forward and absolutely put these things into the public consciousness. Because otherwise, people are going to very conveniently forget and very conveniently double down on this failure to acknowledge.
I don't know if I want to use the word trauma, but definitely this work is very emotionally difficult. And it's not because you're telling one, just the story in general is difficult, but then you're telling the story of your own ancestors, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you there's not an ability to detach from the story making. So can you talk about how you dealt with the emotional nature of this work? How did you cope or manage, or did you?
Yeah, I kind of didn't. I thought, I'm a real smart cat. I've been doing this for 20 years. There's a crew, they are actors. I know exactly what we're doing. There are no surprises, which is a great privilege because many of these things actually happen. Can you imagine you're going about your day, the wife, the family unit you built out of the detritus of all these families being broken, now at a moment's notice, that is snatched away. Very different experience than having to make this. And I thought, okay, cool, that'll be enough to protect me through this process. I know nothing I'm going to deal with is even remotely comparable to what my ancestors dealt with. And yet we're in the actual spaces. We're in the actual spaces. And I do believe that somehow, some way, that soil down there,
Mm.
it's the same damn soil. And it would catch up to me. It would catch up to me. There was a day where I just walked myself off set and say nothing to nobody, just walked off, which is very expensive. On a show this big, a moment when I'm not present is very expensive because nothing happens. And then there was another day we had a guidance counselor, a therapist named Kim White. I called her Miss Kim, where she tapped me and she pulled me off my own set. And I said, "Yo, you can't pull me off set, man. I gotta be strong for the crew. They see me talking to you, man, and they go feel like something's wrong." And she was like, "Yeah, you got to be strong for them, but who's going to be strong for you when you break down?" And so she pulled me aside and we had a little session and I unleashed some things and then I got back to it. But I felt this responsibility because again, we've done a poor job of acknowledging what our ancestors dealt with and building this country. We've done a poor job. We've again, you were talking about these images often being quite demeaning, both for the audience and for the characters. And there's been a lot of talk about sacrifice, very heinously in regards to the trial of Derek Chauvin and the murder of George Floyd. And so I don't like to use the word sacrifice as it relates to my ancestors, but I do think it's a sacrifice unique amongst the world because typically in a sacrifice, you think of someone dying. And in this case, our ancestors sacrificed by continuing to live through all this degradation. And there was something about really understanding that and really getting to a point, and I'm walking around these sets and I'm literally seeing my ancestors. I can hug them. It's why I wanted to turn the camera on them so often. And it was kind of cool to be there and realize, yes, my ancestors were enslaved, but this pushed past that. They were blacksmiths, they were midwives, they were herbalists, they were spiritualists. Reaffirming that like every day, it built up almost like this muscle layer where eventually I understood, okay, I'm running this long ass marathon. And when this show is done, I got to hand the baton to someone else. The same way Nicole Hannah-Jones handed it to me when she finished the 1619 project. And in that way, I kind of got my window. I was ready to go. So Kanye West went into TMZ and he said slavery was a choice. You remember that?
Yeah, of course.
So we were in pre-production when that happened, and again, just same thing with ADOS. I'm always trying to go, how do I understand what this person is saying? Because I remember being a kid, and we were like, yo, if I was a slave, I'd have been in the house. If I was I'd have ran. They'd have had to kill me. Boom, boom, boom. The dumb shit you say as a kid. And I thought, what is that? What he's saying? And then I tried to unpack it. What choices did my ancestors have? And doing this research, you understand how militaristic this whole system was, whether the weaponry or communication. If everyone had taken up arms, if everyone had rebelled, everyone would have perished. It was just such a virulent system and such a well-oiled system. I then also realized, again, these people were herbalists. They could have systematically wasted themselves away if they wanted to, if they decided the life wasn't worth living. But there were children everywhere. I mean, there were children everywhere. The same way with stop and frisk, we need prisoners everywhere to feed this system. There were children everywhere. And then I thought, oh, the choice was to live and protect these children because somehow they had faith that eventually those children would beget children who would not be under the yoke of slavery and who could perfect themselves as citizens of this country or people of this world. And so in the show, we have children everywhere. It's really, as you go on, you realize it's kind of about parenting. And I decided in my mind, this show is about honoring what I think is the greatest act of collective parenting the world has ever seen.
Hmm.
World has ever seen. 2 decades later, there are men born into slavery who witnessed atrocities and horrors and brutalities who are sitting in Congress, who are actively trying to work through legislation, as you said, to help make this democracy a better democracy. How is that possible? Through the greatest act of collective parenting the world has ever seen. I'm like, this was the choice. And I'm like, we have to recontextualize so that when we see our ancestors, that's the first thing we see. It is the first, the last thing we see. Children were born separated from their fathers and mothers. They would arrive someone else and it would be immediately,
Yes.
we're going to do this. And we think of Black fathers and Black mothers as being uncaring, absentee.
Yeah.
We think of Black mothers giving their children whatever they need as spoiling. I'm like, no, 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 no. The greatest act of collective parenting in the world. You and I would be impossible without this parenting. And I was like, oh, that's not what he meant, but it's what he meant. You know, I'm going to believe glass half full is what he's meant, because I think that's what it was. And I think that's what the show is about for me, and it's kind of where I've arrived at it. But I haven't said that to anyone as well versed on this as you. So I wanted to say it to you, boss lady, because I do believe it's true. I really do.
Yeah, I never thought about it that way. I understood. Yes, I mean, we survived on collective parenting. This is why our kinship ties are not necessarily blood, right? It's why we have so many cousins and aunties and that less formal family structure. We had no choice. We were constantly having to remake family and expand family and take care of each other. Another thing we for, but I didn't think about this collective act of parenting as a community. And that is true. I don't know if I'm going to give Kanye the credit that you are, but you're a kinder person than me. But what I will say is, my favorite Langston Hughes poem is this poem called Mother to Son. And it is an enslaved mother writing to progeny that she won't live to see. And she talks about everything that she had to go to. And she said, because she carried inside of her the seed of the coming free. And that's what I think about all the time, is what we saw as submission or weakness was actually the greatest act of resistance, was to survive. And to say, one day I will produce the children who will be free and they will enjoy the bounty of the land that they built. And we don't give our ancestors enough credit for that, for surviving. White people during slavery actually believed that we could not live without slavery. They actually believed that at emancipation, we would die off because we were a race who could not take care of ourselves. Now, dismissing all of our history in Africa, where we were the first human beings ever, they literally thought we couldn't survive without slavery, that we would just die out. And so Black survival, despite everything that we've been through, is the greatest gift. Every Black person grows up hearing Black people are the strongest people in the world. And it always sounded nice, but I've come to realize that's probably true.
It has to
be. We marched from the interior of Africa on a 500-mile journey, survived being in the slave castles for weeks and weeks and weeks, survived then being brought across the Middle Passage where 40% sometimes died before they made it, survived slavery, survived Jim Crow. You are strong people. The people who remained, the people who were able to live through that, I don't know. I don't know if there could be a stronger people in the world. And if we were taught to think about it in that way, I think we could rid ourselves of this collective shame about the fact that our ancestors were once enslaved. This felt like the very first conversation we ever had. I know you remember. Yeah. So always good to talk to you.
Yeah. And I'll see you next week.
Yes, Lord have mercy. I can't wait. I need some sons.
Yeah, thank you, my dear. This was
Thank you for your work, though. It's just so powerful, and I'm just honored to be working in the same time period as you.
mutual, boss lady, mutual.
All right.